Hi, my name is Bruce Bolger. I'm founder of the Enterprise Engagement Alliance, and we're an education and outreach group dedicated to spreading the word about the practical implementation of stakeholder capitalism through a strategic process of engagement across the enterprise. And this is the first of a series of updated education programs really focusing on practical implementation. There's been a tremendous amount of work on the importance of stakeholder management, the economics, the value that it creates. And we really want to get to implementation. And there's really no better way to start than with the gentleman who I think we can give credit to having really started this academic and business approach. Maybe he won't take credit for it. It goes back a little bit more. We'll touch into that a little earlier. But anyway, that's Edward Freeman, or R. Edward Freeman. He's a professor in business administration at the University of Virginia. It's Darden School. And he's author of the original books about stakeholder management, including strategic management to stakeholder approach. So we're going to be talking about the definition, history, framework, requirements, implementation essentials, and a few other observations in less than an hour. Again, we always have to thank the organizations that provide funding that help us provide this education program. And these are the books available by Edward Freeman, and one of them, Managing for Stakeholders, is actually part of our formal curriculum for those of you who go on to do that. So I'm going to stop the share right now. Excuse me. And I'm going to get right to it. Ed, thanks again for joining us. So, sir, what is stakeholder theory, stakeholder management?
Well, Bruce, stakeholder theory, stakeholder management, stakeholder capitalism, however you want to say it, is it's a really simple idea. It's a simple idea about how to operate a successful business. There are two kind of important things here, at least for my version of this. One is that stakeholders are interconnected. In other words, customers, suppliers, employees, communities, and the people with the money, shareholders, financiers, and others, their interests kind of go together. And one of the things that happens is we oftentimes single out one of those, mostly shareholders, and say, let's just focus on them. But you can't do that because they're connected to what you do with customers, suppliers, employees, and communities, for instance. And two, so there's this idea that businesses have always created and sometimes destroyed value for stakeholders. Usually they don't mean to, but sometimes they do. And that's always been the case. The second piece here is not just that their stakeholders, their interests are joined. The second piece is that in today's world, you really need a sense of purpose and ethics to do this well. In other words, it's not just creating value for investors by taking stakeholders into account. Yes, that is how you create value for investors. That's true. But you do that, and it's about being responsible. Because if you're not responsible as a business in today's world, that's going to be all over social media, the news, etc., and you're going to have essentially hell pay. So let me back up just for a second and say there's sort of two senses of thinking about stakeholders, and they're connected with each other, and they have to be connected to each other. The first sense is what I would call a strategic sense. And it says, gee, if I'm going to have an effective strategy, I got to figure out what I'm doing with customers and suppliers and employees, etc., and how those things are connected to each other. And the second sense is what I call an ethics sense. And the ethics sense says, you know, this is going to work a lot better if I have a purpose that I stand for. This is going to work a lot better if I have some ethics, some values that hold this company together. So it's a really simple idea. It's easy to say. It's kind of hard to do, because what makes it hard to do is figuring out what those connections are among the stakeholders. It's a lot easier just to say, well, doesn't profit measure everything, and I'll just focus on that. The problem is that leaves so much value on the table. It's not even funny.
Well, and we're going to get to that, thankfully, here. And it also, Ed, purpose also solves this problem of people concerned about decisions that you're making, because if you've stated your purpose clearly and you make a decision along with that purpose, stakeholders can't object. You've established, they can't say you're being pressured by disinterested parties because you're consistent with the purpose.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure how to sort that out, because I'm not exactly sure why disinterested parties would press you. That seems a little bit like a gigantic waste of time for them to me, but again, maybe they do. Purpose is funny. It's an idea that doesn't live in the statement. It doesn't live in the purpose statement. Purpose lives in the systems. It lives in the processes. It lives in the way you make decisions. And oftentimes we don't agree that this decision is consistent with the purpose. And so there is conversation that has to take place, and that conversation has to be alive. If you think you've got your purpose and you got it for all possible decisions, all possible things, you don't understand what a purpose is.
Yeah.
You get challenges to it all the time. Stakeholders raise challenges, employees raise challenges, and they should, because if this is important to you, you want to know when you're living it and when you're not.
So when did and how did you come up with this theory?
Well, first of all, I have a little bit of a problem thinking about this as a theory, because oftentimes people will denigrate it and say, well, it's a theory, but it's not real.
Yeah.
See, my PhD's in philosophy, and I was just trying to figure out what this business thing was. And as I looked out at what businesses were doing and what they were saying to me, I was at Wharton at the time, it seemed to me what businesses did was they created value for customers, suppliers, employees, communities, and the people with the money. That seemed to me to be exactly what they were doing, even if they didn't understand that's what they were doing. They may have thought that they were just making money for shareholders. But if you peel that back a little bit and really look at what they're doing, their products and services, their customers, their elaborate measurements for how that's going on, there things like supply chain going on with suppliers, and some companies seeing suppliers as partners. Their employees who I could treat as either just having a job and paying them, or I could treat them as partners and being engaged. And there were communities where I could figure out how to be a community builder, or I could figure out, essentially how not to care and wait for the community to attack me. And of course, you got to make money in those things. If you don't make money, this is the biggest mistake people make. They think somehow profits are bad. That's like saying, I have to make red blood cells to live. It's like saying making red blood cells is bad. Businesses have to have profits to exist. But it doesn't follow that the purpose of a business to make profits, just like it doesn't follow, I hope, that the purpose of my life is to make red blood cells. That's really not much worth living for. So I didn't invent a theory. First of all, other people, had the idea and developed it before me. I just wrote a book about what it would be like if you took this idea seriously. And it came from being very fortunate to work with a group of people and a whole group of companies that were starting to take the idea seriously back in the late 1970s, early 1980s.
So when you published the book, and I believe it was 84, ironically, what did you hope to happen?
Well, I hoped that I didn't know much about how the publishing thing worked in business, and I hoped that lots of business people would read the book. I didn't write it as an academic book. It's full of cases and examples and tools and techniques and etc. I did do some academic stuff in the book in a couple of the chapters, but I had expected lots of business people to read it. I used it in a seminar I did for, in those days, AT&T, that we put about 1,000 people through how to implement this stuff, how to do the tools and techniques, and how to think about it. So that's why I don't think about it as a theory looking for a place to be implemented. I look at it as just a better way to think about how business works. And I knew academics would, some of them at least, would take it seriously, because in writing the book, I had spoken to a number of schools. I didn't know it was gonna kind of fall with a big thud when it was published as much as it did. They only printed about, I think, 2,500 copies of the book, which is not very much. And we gave a lot of those away. So I don't think many people read it, quite honestly. And even though it has something like 50,000 citations by academics now, I don't know how they read it, because there weren't that many copies.
Well, you're the first person I've ever known who's written a book who admits that it's not a best-selling, New York Times best-selling author.
I
Anyway,
wish.
but let me ask you, though, nonetheless, the influence of that book is very significant. You're being very humble, because it's, correct me if I'm wrong, hasn't an academic field really kind of developed out of that? And I will say that the professors that I talk to really do look to you, even though your work is branched out. There are different elements, shared values. You've heard of that movement, but it seems that a lot of people do give credit to that kind of. Has stakeholder management as part of strategic teaching flourished, would you say, even if it hasn't yet?
Well, yes, it has. And what's happened is, I think what I did was asked a number of very interesting questions that allowed people to figure out how to ask more questions. That's pretty much what academics do. I thought I was a strategy guy. I thought the strategy academics would care. They didn't at all, except for a couple. Jeff Harrison from University of Richmond was one. There are a couple more, but not too many. And the people who took on this idea were academics who worried about business ethics and worried about corporate social responsibility. They saw a way to, in the stakeholder idea, to make those kind of more precise. I've often said, I think you should figure out what kind of problem you're trying to solve. And stakeholder theory tries to solve three problems that are interconnected. The first problem is, how's business, value creation, and trade? How's business possible in a world where there's not much stability anymore? And that was the world that you could see coming in the 1980s, a world in which was going to be more global. There wasn't going to be the protectionism that existed. All that stuff was going away, and you could see it in the automobile business. You could see it from the way people were trying to understand quality and how that movement went on. The second problem is, how do we deal with the ethics of capitalism? There have been criticisms of that for a very, very long time, and that seemed to me to be reaching some kind of crescendo in the 80s. And the third problem was, what are we going to teach in business schools? Shouldn't we teach stuff about how business actually works, as opposed to some theoretical notion about how it could work if markets were only perfect? And so trying to look at those were the three problems. They're still the three problems that I think about most every day.
Well, we have some questions, and I'm going
Sure.
to let people. I'm going to break this up because I'm actually going to segue right into implementation. Our first question: the value which we are talking about, is it different from the economic value? If yes, is it measurable? In other words, great question. It isn't value isn't necessarily money, is it?
No, that's a great question. I see value in much broader sense. You could think about it in what economists called utility terms. There can be some problems with that. In other words, I might get a lot of value from my iPhone here because I've got several programs that would let me make music on it, that I could write songs, and that's a value. I'm not going to monetize that, but it's a value. It's valuable to me, and so value. Economists had an old idea, which I like, called the value in use. In other words, what's the use value of a product, not just its price? And those ideas, I think, are more practically oriented about how business works in the real world. So yes, it's different than economic value. Is it measurable? Sure. If measurable in no other way than let me tell you how much I think it's valuable and then track that measure over time. In other words, we can use perceptual measures and then look at changes in perceptual measures. That's actually how people look at stocks. It's a what I think this stock is going to do over time, and then I track that measure based on where the earnings might go or not go, or other information that's there. So there are lots of these perceptual measures that we can use.
So, Jubal, your colleague Jeff Harris said to me the other day that, hey, what is the value of being happy at work? What is the value of wanting to go to work on a Monday morning?
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
okay, so we're going to get to your other questions, sir. I believe it's a sir. In a few minutes, I want to get back to this now because we're moving to implementation. Uh, so, all right, let's say I've read your book. I'm a CEO, and this applies to any size organization. What are the first things I have to think about in actual implementation to step back and stop using just my quarterly earnings as my guidelines and really having a stakeholder approach? What is that framework from which I, start?
So I'm going to give an answer that probably no one likes because I don't think there's one framework for every company.
Good.
I think there are lots of ways to start. In other words, it may turn out that a company has sort of lost its original purpose. It needs to focus on trying to regain that. It may turn out that a company is not very good at dealing with its communities. Walmart was a classic example of going through a phase where it wasn't very good at that. And it worked on that, and it's much, much better today. It's one of the leading companies in figuring out how to deal with the community stakeholder. It might turn out, and this is the place where my sense is many companies need to start. They're not very good in terms of understanding their employees. And so they need to start there. Maybe they have a purpose statement. Maybe they're good with customers, but they might do it at the expense of employees. And there's another place you could start in terms of societal issues. You could say, well, again, Walmart started by trying to turn things around by trying to understand sustainability and what what it needed to do to make its communities even better. And you might start with ethics. So that's a hard place to start. But sometimes companies need to start with that. So it's these 5 things that you need to be aware of, Bruce. For starters, I would say it's purpose and profit. It's stakeholders and financiers and shareholders. It's thinking about societal issues and market issues. It's thinking about our humanity as well as our economic well-being. And it's thinking about ethics and business. And there are lots of ways to start to be more stakeholder oriented, to have more of a stakeholder mindset. There are lots of places to start. I've helped lots of companies all over the world, starting in really different places with it. But those are sort of the 5 big picture things. Now, look, you could also start and say, you know, what I really want is I want to focus on the sales process here and how we treat our customers. Do we treat them with dignity and respect? And that might lead you somewhere to say, well, wait a minute, the way we think about how we sell used cars has a lot to be gained here. And you might invent a company called CarMax. So again, I think there are lots of places to start, and it's pretty easy to start somewhere because, after all, this is not some radical idea. This is just an idea about how to do business better.
Well, we have another question from the same questioner. We will get to you. So in terms of implementation then, to actually make this happen, it really has to start with the CEO, doesn't it? It just can't bubble up, or
it's like any change. It's oftentimes easier if it starts with the CEO and the CEO means it.
yeah.
It's hard, it's impossible if it starts with the CEO and CEO doesn't mean it. But I've also seen changes that start from the middle, or that start from the bottom even. You have to have leadership for change. That leadership could be by position, but it doesn't have to be. It can. Some people are extraordinary at getting others to follow them and do something without any position of authority, etc. It's obviously easier, and because we think of companies as these hierarchical things, it's easier when the CEO says, okay, we need to rethink our purpose, and I'm serious about it.
Well, now, and also getting down to implementation, one of the big obstacles I've seen in other people who've done research in this, getting down really to the nitty gritty, are the silos within organizations.
Yeah.
Sales, marketing, don't even like each other. HR doesn't like sales. I mean, I hear it all the time. Do many organizations have a structural impediment to a stakeholder approach when everybody is so really almost looking at it in terms of fiefdoms?
Well, what those are impediments to is figuring out how stakeholder interests are interconnected, right? Usually we think about marketing as dealing with customers. We think about operations as dealing with suppliers. We think about HR as dealing with employees. And we don't think about how to integrate those things. But if you've understood anything I've said for the last 40 years, stakeholder mindset's about integrating those things. It's about trying to figure out how what we do with customers affects what we do with employees, affects what we do with suppliers, etc. And those stovepipes really get in the way. Now, one of the things people try to do early on in this, and still do, is to say, well, wait a minute, there's an idea, we have internal stakeholders. And so, the salespeople would see the product people often as internal stakeholders. And there's nothing wrong with that, especially if it helps you say, I've got to understand this group and I need to work with them and be partners. Then that's good. But you also need to understand it's too easy in a bureaucracy to just focus on the internal stuff. And if a business is going to be successful, it's because customers buy stuff. Suppliers make you better. You know, communities don't pass stupid laws that mean you can't do things. So you gotta have an external focus to this as well. You can't overcome those internal squabbles by just saying, well, they're internal stakeholders. That helps, and it's not that it's wrong, but you need to also have some external points of contact here.
And this is a great example. I'm going to go to this question, one of these questions now, so we don't let them build up, of something being a lot easier said than done. Next question here from the same individual. Professor Freeman, what are your views? And by the way, this is sort of an inside talk. She must be a professor. What are your views on the share of normative considerations in the stakeholder world as the world sees it today? Is it adequate, or is there a scope for more of normativity in the way stakeholder theory is seen by academics today versus, being instrumental? I believe if you want to explain it, the difference between normative and instrumental in this movement, if you will.
So in a famous paper, two researchers, Tom Donaldson and Lee Preston, wrote a paper that said, this is in the 90s, look, you can divide stakeholder theory into three things. You can think about descriptive stakeholder theory. I'm just trying, and I've said this before, I'm trying to describe how business works, how successful businesses work, and that's descriptive. Or there could be normative, how could it work better? And there are lots of people, I've written about that as well. And then there's a third idea called instrumental, which is if you want to create shareholder value, then you got to deal with stakeholders. And this normative, instrumental, and descriptive were sort of three ways to divide up the research. Donaldson and Preston actually had a fourth one. And this is the one I would say is most interesting. The stakeholder theory is managerial. It's at once normative, descriptive, instrumental, and about how you run a successful business. And so I think the academic world is the academic world is more prone to think of itself as being scientific and not normative. I'm trained as a philosopher. I've always taught in business schools. I don't have that burden.
Well, that's while you recovered there.
Scientists are normative too, and so I think those things go together, and we have to think about this as fundamentally a managerial view about how to run a successful business.
Well, that is so important in terms of the debate that's going on about stakeholder capitalism that we might have a few minutes at the end. And I will get to the next, there's two more questions, but I'm going to get back to you on this. Apparently, this is somebody who knows your work well. So in any case, what do you think? I think the last time you and I spoke, and I didn't agree with you, that we're in baseball terms, we might be in the top of the fourth inning. And I've been at it almost as long as you, and I'm not quite as optimistic, but wherever we're at, what is standing in the way of adoption? Because it makes total sense. Well, I mean, how can you create wealth without the other stakeholders? It's impossible. So to me, it's obvious.
Look, when I wrote that old book, Bruce, I didn't think it was really very interesting. Certainly the stakeholder idea wasn't very interesting. It was just too much common sense. Now, I also wrote about purpose in that book in a way that nobody ever realized. And I thought that was much more interesting. I called it enterprise strategy. And I looked at lots of different ways that you could have a purpose. One of them was to have a purpose about all you care about shareholders. But there's another one that was all you care about is shareholders. All you really care about yourself, but you pretend to care about shareholders. And so that felt like a lead balloon too. So, it is a very simple idea. And I'm sorry, but the cough.
No, please. We have time.
Allergies are killing me in Virginia here.
Just take a moment to pause. Don't worry.
Great. Just remind me again now what you want me to.
Okay. Well, I was talking about what do you think is standing in the way of greater
adoption? Right.
Something that's so obvious.
So I would say, look, we're just in the grip of the old story. We're in the grip of this old story that business is about the money. Think about how far that goes in society. Been some studies that show that on network TV, it's I'm going to get the number wrong, but it's some number like 75-80% of the murders on network TV are done by executives. And in reality, it's like 1%. When you look at how business is portrayed, even in cartoons for kids, you probably remember the Flintstones.
Of course.
And you remember Fred Flintstone's boss, who was an idiot. And even for Fred Flintstone. So you see how you see how the view of business is demonized, and we have this idea again that there's something wrong with money. There's something wrong with wealth, and that's not to say that inequality isn't a problem, but it's to say we've demonized business. It's something I call the business suck story. That business is morally questionable. I tell people I teach business ethics, and they have to manage not to laugh, or, must be an oxymoron. Two words, you put them together like jumbo shrimp, or must be a short course, or I didn't know business had any, or theoretical subject, and I think that old story really has a grip on us. And, there are other barriers as well, but until we get rid of that old story, we're not going to make as much progress as we could. Think about it. Think about how long we've been trying to get rid of the old story that men and women are morally equal, or that people with different color skin are morally equal. We've been at that over 100 years. It's better now, but that story those old stories have a real grip on us, and it's hard to escape it.
Well, and of course, one of the ways can be in our classrooms. Are you seeing more education in schools on this, looking at things from a stakeholder standpoint rather than the cash the shareholder?
Well, certainly in business schools, there are courses in most schools around ethics and responsibility and those kinds of things, and they usually talk about stakeholders, at least somewhat. In some, there are whole courses on the stakeholder idea, and some a few schools have really put it throughout their curriculum, as we have here at Darden. There's probably more to be done with respect to that. It probably is more important to kind of call out where the old story has a grip on us. If we're constantly trying to say, is this project profitable? Is this project profitable? Is this project profitable? And we don't ever say, what does this project do to the relationship we have with customers? Or is this project consistent with our purpose? We've let the old story kind of tell the tale here. And so you have to really be vigilant here, I think, with a sense of purpose. And you have to make that conversation alive. Purpose isn't a panacea. I mean, if I managed to work at a school that tries to inspire students to be responsible. Now, not everything we do fulfills that. And we have to be vigilant if we believe in that purpose at trying to say, well, let's try this one, or let's try this one, and let's not do this. And so it's making that conversation about purpose alive, not just on a mouse pad. Or, I mean, I've had so many people say to me, yeah, we have values. Here, I got a card here somewhere. I can tell you what they are. You know, and that's the thing is we've got to, in a sense, you have to root out the old story. I was working with a big company, big energy company recently, and we were working on sort of a new purpose statement, and they knew that the statement was just kind of step one in this.
Yep.
And CEO finally asked a group of about 50 senior managers, just, anybody ever use the old purpose statement in figuring out what to do? And of course, not a single hand went up in the room. And he said, okay, so we're sure this is dead then. Well, it was dead in that sense, but I'd be willing to bet there were some systems and processes that needed to kill it a little more. You know, that it had been instantiated, you know, reified, whatever the fancy word is you want, in the systems and processes in the organization. And that's where the disconnect and the barrier often is. People are willing to think about stakeholders. They're willing to think about purpose and ethics and those things. Those are good. They're not so willing to take apart their systems and processes.
Well, and that gets to my next point about the whole implementation. Doesn't it, at the end of the day, if you're going to have a stakeholder approach, you know, I liken it to total quality management because I lived that. I saw the chaos of what quality looked like, reactive buzzwords, little coffee mugs, right? Meanwhile, companies were building in 10% defect rates into their business model. And then the Japanese came along. So maybe you disagree, but I would view the issue today very similar to quality management in the 80s, chaos, talk, lots of talk, but really very little action. Doesn't, at the end of the day, require really changing your business operating system, or let's just say refining it so that you build purpose into it rather than put it up on the wall and forget it?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you have to do it piece by piece, step by step. You can't. I'm distrustful of, we're going to come in, totally redefine your systems here. Generally, those are systems that people want to discard almost immediately. I've been through some of those, but you do have to build it into the way you work every day. You know, what does it take to have people show up at work with more of themselves? It takes more than, it takes probably overhauling your HR system, but it probably also means thinking through the practices of how the HR people and non-HR people actually interact every day. But you have to be willing to do it at that level, at the level of what I call the transactional level, and it is about everyday transactions, but it's in the context of what's our relationship going to be. And if you can't work at it at that level because of issues in the culture, etc., then you're not going to make much progress.
And this is what has me a little bit concerned about this movement, because as we move down toward the end of this, and then, by the way, we have questions that are kind of an academic nature, and we're going to have time for you to, you know, answer the questions of, I believe, a colleague. But I really, some of these are kind of, you know, forgive me, but a little bit arcane. Not wrong, not incorrect, but you know, this is for general interest audience here.
Right.
But we'll get to you. Don't worry. We're happy that you joined us. But anyway, moving on this, what concerns me is that this isn't being taught anywhere to management. They're not. I've been to hundreds of education programs in marketing and sales, and so rarely do I hear anybody talk about the interactions between sales and customer service, or the way sales is actually conducted today, which is really rather exploitative rather than helpful. That's another story. Doesn't it concern you that right now we're at the point where people are beginning to understand take stakeholder management concepts without a clue how to actually operationalize that? Is that an issue?
Uh, well, having written 5 or 6 books about how to operationalize this stuff, I mean, it's an issue, but I think it's also a little too fast to say no one has an idea about how to do this. Companies are doing it.
No, I didn't mean to
They're
say that.
they're they're
Most. Sorry.
again. I don't.
Okay.
I'm not sure, because again, companies have always created value for customers, suppliers, employees, communities, people with money. They know how to do that. What they don't know how to do sometimes is figure out the interactions.
Yeah.
You know, it's like and if you do figure it out, it's like the Moliere character in the 17th century that thought he had to learn a new language called prose. And when somebody told him, "No, you're speaking prose," he went, "Oh, okay." I mean, you don't have to learn a new language called stakeholder, but you have to realize that that's what you're doing and that those interests are connected. And if you realize that, guess what? You can do it a lot better. You can figure out ways to avoid making trade-offs that are there. You can use your human ingenuity and imagination. So I don't think there's a big secret here of how to implement this. I think you got to kind of get the idea. And if you get the idea and just kind of follow the logic, that that will take you on a journey in your business for what makes sense for your business, about how your stakeholders are connected to each other, and how what you bring to the party creates value.
So what you're saying, and I like you said this earlier, you can start small within your organization. It doesn't
Yeah.
necessarily have to be a revolution. You don't have to bring in the whole change management, transformation people. You can actually, hey, let's try this in sales. Let's try this in our operations department. It's not something that has to be globally.
It's happened many times. I can remember a group years ago where two parts of a company, they were under two different vice presidents who didn't get along, and the layer underneath that called the vice presidents oil and water because they didn't mix. And they actually hired me to help them figure out how they could avoid the fact that their bosses didn't work very well together by seeing each other as stakeholders, by trying to understand who their common external stakeholders were, etc., and by trying to understand what the systems were that were in place and how they spent their time and attention. It wasn't any difficult stuff. I mean, difficult in terms of trying to figure out what these human relationships are and how they can go bad, and trying to figure out how we can make them successful. We all know how to do this because a lot of us have children, and we do that. Everything I've said, is about, in part, how we deal with our kids. Maybe it's a smaller scale, but it's not rocket science.
So we have the innate skills. It's just a matter of stepping back and looking how to look at through a business through a different lens. The
Yeah, but
interconnectivity of our stakeholders.
yeah, but the skills, I would say the skills are different than the skills that we typically. I think this is part of what you've seen. The skills are different than the typical ones we teach in management. For instance, I would say it's either 4 that are incredibly important. One is creative imagination. how do I use my imagination and not just accept trade-offs, but to try to think through ways that I could satisfy multiple stakeholders at the same time. And there are lots of ways to think about that. You can think about, in the negotiation world, multiple currencies, etc. I think I wrote a paper about that with a fellow who's now a very famous consultant named Ram Charan, who was a mentor of mine. A paper in, I think it was 1980, called Negotiating with Stakeholders, in which we talked about that, but it was using the imagination here. A second is sort of emotional social intelligence. There's no substitute for trying to understand what these other creatures walking around that look like you, called human beings, what really makes them tick. And not what makes all of them tick, because then we're stuck with stuff like, money or self fulfillment, or whatever you think of the Maslow stuff. But what makes you tick, right? Can I understand how I'm going to have a relationship with you? Not everybody. The third thing is, again, this communicating, being able to communicate or negotiate with stakeholders. And that's very different. If you think about several times, I'll never forget a guy who was a consumer advocate named Curran Shields. He was head of this organization called the Conference of Consumer Organizations. And they were actually a really big, important player in the telecom business some years ago, because companies needed to get their approval on things. And Curran said to me once, he said, when somebody looks at a customer and says, "I'm sorry, I can't do anything," that's company policy. And that ends it for the company. That's where it starts for us. And trying to communicate with people like Curran Shields is very different than trying to communicate with the people who work for you.
And the fourth.
The fourth is to try to understand what it means to be values and purpose driven, and how important giving and receiving feedback is. So creative imagination, emotional social intelligence, communicating or negotiating with stakeholders, and this being values and purpose driven, especially around issues of feedback, are incredibly important. Those are skills. Look, all the analytical stuff, the AIs are going to be doing all that. So this is all we got.
So finally, as you know, and then I am going to leave time for our fellow educator here who has some very smart questions.
Sure.
Again, I think you've given us a very good framework here. Again, defining stakeholder management, that it's really not a theory, it's a practical business. That it doesn't require, it's not, as you say, rocket science. It does require these 4 new skill sets that you talk about, that you've just beautifully summarized. And it requires companies really to be authentic and committed to developing a purpose, and to aligning all of the different parts of their organization toward that, and making it part of the system. But what you've also said, it doesn't have to be a revolution. You don't have to bring in armies of consultants, and you can start small, but you can't fake it. I think that's a fundamental
well, you can, it just won't work very well.
Well, yeah, thank you very much. So then I think those are sort of the fundamental principles. And of course, anybody who joins our organization gets your book, and they can delve into that. And of course, they don't have to join to buy the book. So anyway, this issue of now it's all of a sudden getting into the public attention, and it really is getting into the public attention. And what really kind of just really surprises me, and I wanted to get your views on this, is it's getting in the public attention, but nobody's actually taking the time to look at the history of what they're attacking.
Well, Bruce, I have to say, as somebody who has spent 40 years not being read, it doesn't really surprise me. Look, this doesn't have anything to do with, I don't know what the left and right mean by woke. I don't. That seems to me just to be one more rhetorical flourish to stop people from having a conversation. I don't know what they mean by virtue signaling. Again, that seems to stop a conversation that, hey, companies might do something good. So I've spent 40 years pissing off the left and the right, and the left think I've sold out the business, the right think I'm a socialist. I don't know what being in the center even means today, because it seems to me you just take the worst ideas of the left and the right. So that conversation is not one that's there are pieces of it, and it's led by business people who are doing this.
Yeah.
If you look at what John Mackey's done with Whole Foods, what he and Raj Sisodia have done with conscious capitalism and the companies that are involved with that. If you look at companies like Kip Tyndall's The Container Store, or the Motley Fool, or any of literally thousands of others, they're out doing it. And they're the people I'm paying attention to. I'm not paying attention to what's the latest op-ed in the Times or the Wall Street Journal. I mean, I gotta confess, my ego's enough that hurts a little bit when I read something that, if they had just read something, not that I wrote, but something that people wrote 20 years before me, they wouldn't make the kind of bad arguments that they're making.
Well, no one has actually studied your field yet, and they will. I've been a journalist my entire life, and we're in the phase now where the fire is going. So they're talking about the fire, but then somebody's going to figure out, well, what is this thing? We're not in the journalists haven't gotten to the what is this thing yet. But anyway, I want to get to these last questions from our very inquisitive individual here. So, and this is a technical question. So those of you who are not interested in stakeholder academics, you can peel off now, but you might find this of interest. So Professor Freeman, what is your view on stakeholder salience, as the 1997 paper is one of the most cited ones, but the authors in 2021 admitted that the NAW paper, which you'll have to explain, and the concept lacks normative considerations. So why then are we all following the mall model for so long? Could you explain that and answer?
Well, I don't know. I think I know why we followed it, why a lot of people followed it for so long.
What is the mall model, please?
Mitchell Wood. Those are the names of the authors of this paper. They're all friends of mine. And they wrote this paper because I had written, in part, a kind of tongue-in-cheek thing that said, look, if you see stakeholders this way, you're really trying to figure out the principle of who and what really counts. And that's really a mistake, because it's not who and what really counts. It's not about priorities. It's about seeing how they go together. And so they wrote a paper that talked about who and what really counts. And they tried to give people a way of calculating which stakeholders were more important.
Wow.
Something that I kind of refused to do. Even though I had tried to do it for a while, and I realized it was kind of the wrong way. What happened was it allowed academics to do more empirical research, because they could now look at, I think there were several variables. Salience was one. There were others. I don't remember what they were in the original one. And it came across as, we can just study this and figure out who was important and who wasn't. And this appealed to the sort of positivism of, just science, it's just the data. There's no real normative or ethical judgments here. So I've never, and all the authors know this, I have never cared much for this paper. It did have, I think, the strength of getting a lot more people interested in stakeholder theory, because they thought, well, good, here's something I can do empirically,
So here's two other questions then. How do you see the interaction of socio-psychological theories like theory of common good, agency theory,
Yeah.
with the stakeholder theory? Where do you see the stakeholder theory would take us interacting with micro foundations of the stakeholder management in the next 10 years?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, I don't know is the answer. In the first chapter of Stakeholder Theory, The State of the Art, we're very clear what we have to say about Friedman, this view that only shareholders matter, Michael Porter, Michael Jensen, and agency theory, and transaction cost economics. We welcome all those thinkers to the big tent of stakeholder theory. We just say, hey, for real business people, that doesn't help very much. It doesn't help very much to know you got an agency problem. It doesn't help very much to know that if I tell you, well, minimize transaction costs. I mean, it's fine. There's nothing you can get a stakeholder-like view out of that. And we show how to do that in the first chapter of that yellow book that was on your screen. It's just not very helpful. And the one of the benefits of thinking about stakeholders in the way we do is more helpful. Now, micro foundations, I'm still, I know people have written about the micro foundations of stakeholder theory. One of my former students who's in business, Adrian Keeble, has written about something called behavioral stakeholder theory, in which the idea is not to look at stakeholders as people in a role, but to look at them as real live human beings who have values that might be different from each other, etc. So what does a behavioral approach to that look like? And Keeble maps out a way that it looks kind of different from the way we think about this. And he's actually running a hedge fund trying to show that his view works.
Wow. Well, people are learning that this is a rich and vibrant field. So her last question, or this individual's last question, if stakeholder theory is managerial, then we accept stakeholder salience as resources that are limited. Then we leave some stakeholders and adopt some. If this is the case, then how would we justify this new view, the social nature of stakeholder utility, where the stakeholders use agency theory in ascertaining their utility from the business, or else they will quit?
Well, where I get off the bus in this question, and this is a question that these come out of the strategy academics who now want to find a place for stakeholder theory, and I appreciate that. But where I get off the bus here is resources are limited. I don't think our imaginations are limited. I think it's an old canard in business that you have limited resources. Look, the whole point of business is to figure out how to do stuff where there's stuff that conflicts. When I travel, I don't want to listen to anybody's music. I want to listen to mine. Thank you, Sony and Steve Jobs, and the others who I'm sure I don't know who invented some way that I could do that. In other words, you invent things precisely because it looks like I can't have them both. And that's what makes business great. It's what makes it a view of social cooperation. It's how we create value for each other. So I think the whole strategy field makes a mistake when it says, and this is because in part, it's beholden to much more to economists, and economists love trade-offs. But that's not I mean, it is how the real world works at some level. People make trade-offs, but trade-offs are intellectually and mentally easy. They're sloppy.
Well,
they should be seen as a failure.
Well, you have one more quick question and then a very grateful thank you. Professor, my last question, do you see the demise of corporate governance soon?
Yeah, it's a great question. I thought I did, but I don't know. The reason is corporate governance as a field, as an academic field, tries to make claims about how all companies should be governed at all times for all situations. I'm a philosophical pragmatist. I think that's a fool's errand. And so I think the questions in corporate governance are a lot less interesting than many other people do. I spent a long time trying to figure out, should we have stakeholders on boards and, all those kinds of things. And it just wasn't, it didn't go anywhere. It seemed to me. What was more interesting was trying to figure out, wait a minute, how can I, if I've got a sense of trying to do the right thing, how can I figure out how to create as much value as I can for my stakeholders? If I don't have a sense of doing the right thing, corporate governance is not going to help me. It'll just prevent me, maybe if it's regulatory, it might prevent me from really screwing up. But we have cases like Enron and others that say, yeah, there's probably, for every governance regulation, there are 2,000 smart lawyers who can tell you how to get around it. So I just became kind of less interested in questions of governance. There's still questions about the governance of capital markets, because it's still possible for not well-meaning funds to attack a company, and because of the way the market works, drive the price down through short selling and make them vulnerable to takeovers, and you've ruined a perfectly good company. So I don't, that needs to be rethought and by smarter people than I am, for sure.
Well, listen, we ran out of time, and thank you so much. So I'm going to leave you the one quick question. You still say we're in the fourth inning of this shift toward a stakeholder approach?
Yeah, I might go fifth or sixth even. I know you don't like that, Bruce. You think it's earlier.
Well,
but
I hope you're right.
I hope I'm right too. I don't have time to consider the pessimistic thing. I don't think there's any going back.
Well, that's great. Thank you again, Professor Freeman. And this tape will be available for everybody for about a week. And then after that, it's only going to be available to our members. So thanks once again for your time, and thanks for your great questions. And your admirer says that this individual is indebted and bows down to you in gratitude.
Well, I appreciate that.
By the way, Ed, I feel the same way, and I mean it.
Thanks.
Anyway, thank you.
Thanks. Appreciate it. Take care.